Hey friends, it's Jimmy quickly dropping in with a reminder to like and subscribe and to hit that notification bell. Also, don't forget to leave a quick comment since it really helps me out in the algorithm. Sunlight dances on the turquoise waters of a hidden bay in Madagascar, illuminating a scene that defies the brutal realities of the 17th century. A crew of pirates, comprised of deserters, freed people, and social outcasts, raises a pure white flag over their newly constructed haven. They gather under a banner dedicated to God and liberty, vowing to abandon the injustices of the world they left behind. In this legendary enclave, former captives are instantly transformed into comrades, and a ship's captain can be voted out of power just as quickly as he was elected. It sounds like the stuff of swashbuckling fiction, and indeed, it might be. This is the tale of Libertalia, a purported pirate utopia said to have arisen in the late 1600s. For centuries, its story has captivated imaginations with promises of radical freedom and equality on the high seas. But how much of Libertalia was real, and how much was simply wishful thinking? To find the answer, we must explore what Libertalia was purported to be and what historians have to say about whether this pirate paradise ever truly existed. The legend of Libertalia begins with a man named Captain James Misson. According to the lore, Misson was a French naval officer from Provence. He was a man of education, an adventurous spirit, and a strong sense of justice. His transformation from a servant of the crown to a radical pirate purportedly began in Rome. While on shore leave, Misson was said to have been appalled by the decadence and hypocrisy of the papal court. It was there that he met a disillusioned Dominican priest named Caraccioli. This former priest became the intellectual engine behind the Libertalia myth. Caraccioli argued passionately that every man was born free, and that the extreme inequality plaguing Europe was a direct violation of natural law. He convinced Misson that the divine right of kings and the institution of slavery were man-made horrors that defied God's divine will. Influenced by these subversive ideas, Misson and Caraccioli eventually found themselves aboard the French warship Victoire. When the captain was killed in a battle against an English vessel, Misson took command. Rather than returning to the rigidity of the French Navy, he proposed a new path to the crew. He spoke to them of a life where they would no longer be subjects to a king, but citizens of their own floating republic. The crew, swept up in the rhetoric of freedom, swore an oath to him. They wouldn't be pirates in the traditional sense, preying on poorly guarded merchant vessels to enrich themselves. Instead, they would be vigilantes of the sea, attacking only those who oppressed others, liberating cargo to survive, and freeing captive Africans destined for the New World. They christened their new society with a name derived from the Latin word for free, setting a course for the Indian Ocean to find a place where their ideals could take root. The colony they allegedly founded, Libertalia, was situated on the northeast coast of Madagascar, likely near Antongil Bay. It was described as a fortress of solitude and strength, protected by two large forts bristling with 40 cannons each, all of which had been liberated from European vessels. Inside this perimeter, the social rules were constructed to be the antithesis of the outside world. In an era defined by rigid class structures and the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade, Libertalia was an anomaly. Wealth and resources were shared in common, a radical practice designed to ensure that no single member grew rich at the expense of another. There was no private property in the traditional sense, and the spoils of their voyages belonged to the community as a whole. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the Libertalia legend was its stance on slavery. In the 17th and 18th centuries, pirate ships were often just as complicit in this trade as merchant vessels. However, Mission's pirates reportedly viewed slavery as the ultimate sin. Whenever they captured a ship, they freed the captives, offered them clothing and food, and invited them to join the colony as full equal citizens. The population of Libertalia became a melting pot of French, English, Dutch, and African peoples, all living under a democratic government. They held councils to make decisions, elected their leaders, and devised their own laws. To unify this diverse group, they even created a new, constructed language, a blend of their various native tongues, symbolizing their complete break from their former nations. Even their white flag was a rejection of the black flag of piracy. This merry band of sea brigands were early modern-day Robin Hoods of the high seas. The legend tells us that for some years, this outlaw community thrived. They farmed the land, built substantial dwellings, and continued their patrols of the Indian Ocean. Their numbers grew, bolstered by new recruits and the integration of the local Malagasy population. However, like all utopias in literature, Libertalia was destined for a tragic end. The narrative concludes with a sudden, devastating surprise attack by native Malagasy warriors who felt threatened by the colony's growing power and sway. The locals were defecting to the pirate republic in such numbers that the social order in their lands was under extreme threat. According to the narrative, this attack was swift and brutal, with most of the pirates being slain. All their defenses and fortifications had been built to fend off attacks from Europeans rather than the native Malagasy people. In the chaos, the settlement was overrun. Captain Misson and a handful of survivors managed to escape to their ships, but their paradise was burned to the ground. The story ends on a final note of melancholy when Misson's ship is lost in a violent storm, taking the founder of Libertalia and his dreams of a better world to the bottom of the ocean. Now you may wonder, given that last bit, how we know all these details, and I think that's a perfect segue into the analysis of the historicity of this pirate utopia. When we step away from the romance of the story and examine the historical record, the mirage of Libertalia begins to fade. The primary and arguably only source for the existence of this colony is a general history of the pirates, published in 1724. The book was credited to a Captain Charles Johnson, a mysterious figure who has never been identified. Some modern scholars and literary sleuths believe that Captain Johnson was actually a pseudonym for the famous writer Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe. The book is a blend of accurate historical reporting and sensational fiction. While Johnson provided verifiable details about real pirates like Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts, his chapters on Captain Misson and Libertalia appear to be entirely fabricated. There are no ship's logs, no official admiralty reports, and no letters from the era that mention a Captain Misson or a settlement called Libertalia. This is a time when European navies were meticulously documenting the threats to their trade routes. A pirate-fortified colony with heavy artillery and a fleet of ships would have generated a mountain of paperwork in multiple countries. The silence from the archives is deafening. Historians overwhelmingly conclude that Libertalia was a literary invention. It's a political allegory created to critique the social injustices of 18th century Europe. By presenting a fictional society that functioned well without class hierarchies, the author was holding a mirror up to his own society's failures. It was most likely a philosophical thought experiment disguised as history, and designed to sell books to a public hungry for tales of the high seas. It may have also served as an abolitionist work, given the pirates' radical commitment to equality and liberating captives from ships. Interestingly, while the specific colony of Libertalia was almost certainly a myth, it was likely inspired by the very real pirate activities on Madagascar during that period. The island was indeed a haven for mariners who had gone rogue. It's well documented that pirates established outposts and small settlements along the coast. These weren't the egalitarian utopias of Mison's vision, but they were places where the strict hierarchies of Europe were discarded. There were instances of pirates marrying Malagasy women and raising families, creating unique blended societies. In the early 18th century, a man named Ratsimilaho, the son of an English pirate and a local princess, managed to unite various tribes into a powerful confederation. While this wasn't a democratic pirate republic, it was a legitimate political entity, born from the fusion of European pirates and indigenous cultures. Ultimately, all evidence points to Libertalia being a fabrication, a high-engagement story sandwiched between real biographies in a 1724 bestseller. Despite this place almost certainly being fictional, 3 centuries later, the legend of Libertalia still attracts attention from both scholars and the public alike. Picture a political crisis so profound, so desperate, that a powerful nobleman, dead and buried for nearly 3 decades, could simply walk back into existence. Not only that, he was welcomed back as a legitimate ruler, despite how absolutely absurd this appears to be on its face. It sounds like something pulled straight from Game of Thrones, but in the brutal political landscape of the mid-14th century Holy Roman Empire, this event actually happened. The man at the center of this historical audacity was known simply as the false Waldemar, and while you may not know his name, his actions would, indirectly, completely reshape the world. The individual at the heart of the original story was Waldemar the Great, a revered member of the House of Ascania. His death in 1319, followed shortly by the death of his minor cousin, marked the abrupt end of the ruling dynasty that had established the Margraviate. When the false Waldemar emerged in 1348, 30 years later, he wasn't merely impersonating a dead man. The King of Germany and Bohemia, the future emperor himself, accepted him as the legitimate ruler of Brandenburg for an absolutely chaotic 2-year period. To understand how a man could seize a major principality, we must first understand the vacuum left by the legitimate ruler. Waldemar the Great died on August 14th, 1319. The Margraviate of Brandenburg, a principality and future core of Prussia and Germany, was plunged into a succession crisis. But the stakes were much higher than usual, because the ruler of Brandenburg was one of just 7 people empowered to vote for the Holy Roman Emperor. When Waldemar's cousin, Henry II, died the following year, the ancient Ascanian line in Brandenburg truly became extinct. This termination of the native ruling house created the perfect conditions for a transfer of power, but it also sowed the seeds of massive future instability. In 1323, the Holy Roman Emperor Louis IV of the House of Wittelsbach saw his opportunity. He awarded the March of Brandenburg to his own son, Ludwig the Elder. This move was immediately controversial because Brandenburg was one of 7 electors in the Holy Roman Empire. The imposition of Wittelsbach rule was profoundly unpopular among the local nobility and citizens, who saw the new rulers as foreign, and they had good reason for this. The previous dynasty had cared deeply about developing Brandenburg, which was a backwater on the frontier of the Holy Roman Empire at this point. The Wittelsbachs had little interest in governing the territory effectively, or developing it in any meaningful sense. To them, this was an underdeveloped land that could be exploited to fund life in the Bavarian heartland, as well as political ambitions throughout the empire. The deep resentment against the foreign occupiers ensured that the moment a symbol of the lost native dynasty appeared, he would attract immediate, widespread support. The people didn't want rule by Bavarians. They wanted the caring rule of the Ascanians back. The appearance of the false Waldemar wasn't an isolated incident of fraud, but a calculated move in the highest stakes game in Europe, the struggle for control of the Holy Roman Empire. The 1340s were dominated by the bitter conflict between the reigning emperor, Louis IV Wittelsbach, and the newly elected rival, Charles IV of the House of Luxembourg. Charles IV, elected King of the Romans in 1346, needed every possible advantage to destabilize his imperial rival. Also, just adding this in during editing, this title, King of the Romans, was the title used for the Kingdom of Germany. Kind of odd, since the Holy Roman Emperor was also the King of Italy, which de jure included Rome, but that's beyond the scope of this video. When Louis IV died in 1347, the conflict didn't cease. Wittelsbach followers immediately elected anti-kings to oppose Charles as the German king. Charles IV sought to consolidate his position by gaining support in the north and diplomatically winning over former enemies. When news arrived in 1348 that a man claiming to be the former Margrave Waldemar had surfaced, Charles IV recognized the immense strategic value of this claim. The pretender was a potential political weapon against the Wittelsbach hold on Brandenburg, which was one of two prince electorates held by the Wittelsbach family. Instead of attacking the Wittelsbachs in Brandenburg, Charles could simply validate the impostor. By granting the false Waldemar official recognition and investment, Charles simultaneously delegitimized the Wittelsbach claim to the electorate and acquired a puppet ruler. After all, if the real Waldemar was still alive, the controversial acquisition of Brandenburg by the Wittelsbachs was null and void. This Waldemar would, so the thought went, be very inclined to vote for Charles as Holy Roman Emperor, and also denied a potential vote to a Wittelsbach candidate. This strategic validation transformed the impostor from a con man into a major player on the imperial chessboard. Charles, seizing the offensive, invested the man claiming to be Waldemar with the Margraviate of Brandenburg on October 2nd, 1348. He did so through his legal authority as the King of Germany, which was implicitly backed by the might of his powerful Czech lands. The narrative employed by the impostor was crucial to his success. Appearing in the Archbishopric of Magdeburg in the summer of 1348, he claimed that the burial conducted in 1319 was a deceit. The real Waldemar was only 39 years old at the time of his death, and somewhat unusually for the time, no one recorded how it happened. This provided a plausible basis for the false burial story. False Waldemar claimed he had spent the intervening time undertaking a pious pilgrimage to the Holy Land. During that time, he said he was living a simple Christ-like existence. This story was compelling for several reasons. First, a pilgrimage explained the long absence and the lack of communication. It also provided a morally acceptable reason for why the beloved Margrave had been gone, while the unpopular Bavarians messed everything up. After all, this is a medieval society where even the least spiritual person would, in essence, appear to be a religious fanatic to our modern eyes. Criticizing someone for listening to God's call to the Holy Land simply wasn't in the cards in polite society. The impostor quickly found adherents, particularly among those who opposed the Wittelsbach dynasty. While his true identity remains unknown, rumors circulated suggesting he might have been a commoner named Jacob Roebuck. Another possibility suggested he had once been in the real Waldemar's employ, allowing him to learn and mimic the Margrave's mannerisms and life details. What's important is that the actual man behind the mask was secondary to the political utility of the identity he assumed. The narrative of the returning native Ascanian prince, ready to oppose the foreign administration, was instantly compelling. Proof of identity in the Middle Ages was often reliant on oaths and recognized features, and the research suggests that physical identification techniques were rudimentary. The narrative provided enough social and political plausibility to satisfy the local populace, and, crucially, the Archbishop of Magdeburg, who had known the original Waldemar. By validating the pretender, the Archbishop and subsequently Charles IV enabled the fraud to assume a physical manifestation of the Ascanian princely house. With imperial backing secured in October 1348, the false Waldemar became the effective ruler of Brandenburg. His 2-year tenure was a period of genuine chaos when imperial politics spilled over into violence in Brandenburg. The impostor commanded significant support, convincing a large segment of the March's population that he was the rightful Ascanian heir. This widespread allegiance forced the legitimate Wittelsbach rulers onto the defensive. Towns and cities were forced to choose which side they were allied to, and the effect of this is still seen today. The town of Brietzen, now in modern Germany, was renamed Treuenbrietzen, or True Brietzen, for staying loyal to the Wittelsbach faction. The political utility of the false Waldemar came to an abrupt end in April 1350, when he was no longer needed. However, this wasn't the result of a sudden investigative breakthrough. Rather, it was a purely diplomatic consequence. Charles IV, having successfully fractured the Wittelsbach position, no longer needed the impostor, and the man of dubious origin was now a major liability. By 1350, Charles had managed to win over key factions in the empire, and was ready to negotiate a broader settlement with the Wittelsbachs. This would stabilize the imperial government under his own growing authority. The resolution came in the form of the Treaty of Eltville in 1349, after Charles defeated a Wittelsbach-backed anti-king in battle. As part of this comprehensive agreement with the Wittelsbach dynasty, Charles IV formally deposed the false Waldemar. This sudden unmasking proves that the impostor's legitimacy had been entirely dependent on the emperor's political will. As part of the agreement, the Wittelsbachs were given back the electorate of Brandenburg, and everyone agreed to forget the whole Waldemar episode ever happened. But there's a really weird postscript to the life of false Waldemar, which has made some question the whole situation even further. Upon his official exposure in 1350, the false Waldemar didn't face the execution or imprisonment that one might expect for a man who had briefly claimed a royal electoral title. Instead, he fled to the court of the princes of Anhalt-Dessau. The princes of Anhalt were kinsmen of the extinct Brandenburg House of Ascania. They welcomed the exposed impostor, allowing him to live out his days under their protection until his death from old age in 1356. Notably, some have found it highly curious that the family he was impersonating took him in as their own. This has led some to speculate there may have been a deeper plot involving the House of Ascania, attempting to regain the throne of Brandenburg. That said, this is just pure speculation, and there's no direct evidence to verify that this was the case. And notably, in a really weird twist, the House of Ascania is, at the present day, known for adult adoptions of rich people who want to use the title Prince of Anhalt. Most famously, in 1980, a man named Hans Lichtenberg was adopted by Princess Marie Auguste of Anhalt. He parlayed this bizarre adult adoption process into a marriage with the actress Zsa Zsa Gabor, but I digress. The story of the false Waldemar offers a powerful lens through which to view the structural weaknesses of the Holy Roman Empire in the mid-14th century. Historical consensus holds that the true identity of the man remains unknown, and attempts to definitively link him to any specific identity have been unsuccessful. His real identity is ultimately irrelevant, as his historical importance lies entirely in his function as a political tool. The crisis was generated not by the man himself, but by the profound systemic instability. This is the instability that allowed Charles, then an imperial claimant, to manufacture legitimacy out of thin air to decimate a rival dynasty. The fact that Brandenburg, a crucial electorate, could be successfully destabilized in such a way says quite a bit about the nature of the Holy Roman Empire at the time. Notably, the repercussions of the false Waldemar's brief appearance were profound and long-lasting. By undermining the Wittelsbachs, Charles IV ensured the eventual transition of Brandenburg to the Luxembourg dynasty in 1373. Brandenburg eventually passed to the House of Hohenzollern in 1415, laying the foundation for modern Prussia, which in turn unified Germany in 1871. It's no stretch to say that if false Waldemar hadn't woken up one day in 1348 and decided to impersonate a long-dead ruler, we'd be living in an entirely different world. Hey everyone, just reminding you that if you want to toss a couple of clams my way, you can do so on the YouTube membership or on Patreon. Now with that said, we've still got more content to cover, so let's get down to business. A legend recounts that a woman once asked the Count Saint-Germain's butler if it was true the Count had already lived during the time of Christ. The butler replied dryly that he wouldn't know, as he'd only been in the Count's service for 300 years. This anecdote, whether apocryphal or not, perfectly captures the paradox of the Count of Saint-Germain. For nearly half a century, he charmed, advised, and startled the courts of Europe. He maintained an image so fantastical that Voltaire dubbed him a man who knows everything. Saint-Germain was and remains a complete mystery, serving simultaneously as a celebrated 18th century polymath and, in modern times, an immortal spiritual guide. But a closer look at the Count suggests that he was, more likely, an agent of an unknown government, trading his reputation for intelligence. Saint-Germain made his entrance onto the international scene in the mid-17th century, but his origins are mired in a fog of deliberate contradiction. He used a variety of names and titles throughout his life, an accepted practice among traveling aristocrats, but one that Saint-Germain employed to an extreme degree. This intentional obscurity allowed him to deflect inquiries and invent fantasies about his past, such as the famous claim of being 500 years old. Historical investigations suggest several possibilities for his birth. One plausible theory places his birth around 1710 in San Germano, Savoy, perhaps as the son of an Italian princess, with a local tax collector as his supposed father. He sometimes claimed to be the son of Prince Francis II Rákóczi of Transylvania. Adding to the chronological confusion, when he arrived in Schleswig in 1779, he told his then patron, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, that he was 88 years old. If this was true, this would push his potential birth year back to 1691. But as with everything with the Count, nothing was certain. The sheer volume of conflicting identities suggests that the Count's obscurity was not merely happenstance, but a vital tool. Many of his contemporaries suggested that his lack of a fixed identity may have been a clue that he was actually an agent of an unknown government. By being simultaneously everyone and no one, his persona provided him with the necessary camouflage to move seamlessly between Europe's royal courts. The Count's influence derived not just from his mysterious background, but from verifiable, multidisciplinary genius. He was a polyglot, fluent in all major European languages, and a verified expert in art, philosophy, history, and science. He was also a celebrated musician, known as a virtuoso on both the piano and violin. Several of his compositions were published and performed in London and Paris, and are still available today, though none are widely performed. However, the most intriguing aspect of his reputation was his connection to the mystical science of alchemy. Saint-Germain claimed to possess knowledge of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, the secrets that would grant wealth and immortality. Unlike common charlatans, he had the ability to demonstrate practical material results that convinced influential patrons. A notable anecdote involves King Louis XV, who presented Saint-Germain with a deeply flawed diamond. The Count took the stone, and upon returning it a month later, it was found to be flawless. After having it weighed and appraised, the king's jeweler valued the improved stone to be far more valuable. This tale, which appears to be true, relies on the assumption that the diamond that was returned was indeed the same gem at all. This so-called ability to transform and improve materials was crucial to his career. His demonstrable skill, whether based on genuinely advanced chemical knowledge or sophisticated trickery, provided him with unparalleled access to the European elite. His success in creating valuable materials, like the improved diamond or his development of rich dyes, validated his position in court in a way mere philosophy could never have achieved. This served as a powerful shield, protecting his potentially true operational work, diplomacy, and intelligence gathering under the guise of an eccentric scientist and artist. The Count's unique position, blending incredible talents with total anonymity, made him invaluable to high-stakes statecraft. Louis XV trusted Saint-Germain implicitly, often using him for sensitive diplomatic tasks. During the height of the 7 Years' War, Saint-Germain was instrumental in secret negotiations. Around 1760, he traveled to the Dutch Republic, attempting to mediate peace talks between Britain and France. These activities were so clandestine that they immediately led to accusations of espionage, suggesting he was working for foreign powers, perhaps the Russians. Though never formally charged, these allegations underscored his role as a necessary, untraceable agent used for sensitive information transfer and back-channel operations. His connection to Russia is particularly suggestive of his influence. Saint-Germain was allegedly present in St. Petersburg and credited by some with assisting the coup in 1762 that led to the overthrow of Tsar Peter III and the ascension of Catherine the Great. Despite a life spent advising kings and claiming access to untold wealth and eternal existence, Saint-Germain's historical narrative culminates in a surprisingly mundane death. He spent his final years under the protection of his admirer, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, in Schleswig in modern Germany. He died on February 27, 1784, and was subsequently buried in a grave in a small church in a tiny town in Schleswig. However, the official record of his death only served as the historical inflection point for the legend of his immortality. When no relatives appeared to claim his belongings, the city auctioned off his possessions, as was the style at the time. The inventory was dramatically anticlimactic. His estate contained only modest personal effects, clothing, and a small sum of money. While most accepted this meant that he was a spy who had spent all his money or a charlatan who never had what he claimed, another story soon emerged. A modest end for a man who boasted of immortal secrets perfectly primed the public imagination for the story of his survival. Almost immediately, reports of his continued existence circulated through Europe. A French countess claimed to have met and conversed at length with Saint-Germain after the storming of the Bastille in 1789. She stated that he accurately predicted France's immediate and terrifying future. She continued to report sightings of him on significant historical dates, including in 1820, noting that he always appeared to be no older than late middle age. As the 19th century went on, these purported sightings tapered off, and for a time this mysterious count became a historical mystery and little more. But then things got really weird. In the 20th century, New Age movements began to latch on to the Count as a figure of great spiritual power. In these new esoteric doctrines, the Count was redefined as the ascended master Saint-Germain, a great spiritual teacher who transcended mortality through alchemy. Present-day adherents believe he currently operates from a higher dimension, guiding and guarding humanity. Under this belief, he sits on a council with such venerated figures like Jesus Christ, Confucius, Gautama Buddha, and a whole bunch of others. The Count of Saint-Germain mastered the art of being a contradiction. He was the man who advised kings and composed beautiful music, but would also allude to the fact that he was 500 years old. He was the wealthy and successful diplomat whose life was filled with intrigue, but died with nothing but modest possessions. Even today, he continues to exist in parallel and contradictory realities. He's the frustratingly opaque, real historical figure whose life, likely as a spy in the service of an unknown power, intersected with many of the crucial decades of the Enlightenment. But he's also a New Age spiritual icon to a fairly significant group of people who hold that he's currently guiding humanity alongside Jesus Christ.